Chapter 47. The Aborigines, Section 6. Efforts of conciliation were made through the medium of 3 women captured by the police, and who, after being treated with kindness, were permitted to return to their tribe and to invite their submission. One of these was seen in the journey and slain in error. After the absence of a few weeks, the survivors prevailed on the chief and 9 other men of the tribe to accompany them to the residence of Mr. Batman. This gentleman and his family assiduously cultivated their goodwill, being one of the few who entertained a strong confidence in the power of kindness. Notwithstanding, after remaining 9 days, they eloped, it is said laden with plunder, displaying in their progress unmitigated hostility. 2 natives, who delivered themselves up to a shepherd and were lodged in the penitentiary at Launceston, after being supplied with abundance of food and clothing, within a month effected their escape and were traced by their outrages. The celebrated chief, Umara, captured by Robertson after 2 years' detention, when his artless manner and apparent reconciliation to his lot threw his keepers off their guard, contrived to abscond. Justice is, however, due to the reputation of a savage. Umara afterwards complained that when employed on the line he was beaten by a constable. Jemmy, who escaped at the same time, had been chained to a bench all night by a similar functionary. The newspapers of the day complained that in jail food sufficient for their appetites had not been always supplied them. The women were declining in health when allowed their liberty. This last was the great cause of their restlessness. They felt the oppression of civilization. They were weary of clothing. The skin was irritated. The instinct which prompts a bird to seek some way of exit also moves a savage. It was not so much indifference to kindness as the passion for roaming, the habit of the race. Nor were they managed always with prudence. They were left to the mischievous influence of low white men, who delighted to terrify, even when they did not positively injure them. It was not until 30 had escaped, nearly equal to the whole number taken, that it was discovered that to retain them, even their prejudices required tenderness, and that they were deeply sensible of contempt. These retreats tended to extinguish the hopes cherished by the friends of the natives and rooted the conviction more firmly in the colonial mind that all efforts to tame them were unavailing. All the plans laid down for their expulsion had been tried and had proved to be impracticable. They still recurred to their usual haunts and made up for their diminished numbers by their improved method, cunning, and audacity. Having committed depredations, they retired with their plunder to the districts reserved for their occupation, and whither it was unlawful to follow them, except for sworn offences. The governor determined to try a movement, en masse, and by the united force of the entire population, to drive the Austral tribes within Tasman's peninsula, a territory joined to the mainland by a neck about 1/4 of a mile in breadth. The success of this plan could never have been considered very promising. The governor expressed his doubt respecting the result while it was in progress, and there is no reason to question that, in putting it to the test, he was moved by the earnest entreaties of the colonists and a conviction that nothing should be left untried to preserve the people committed to his charge. On the 7th September, 1830, the intention of the governor was officially announced. Referring to the outrages of the natives, he asserted that their expulsion was impossible, but by a simultaneous effort. He called on every settler, whether residing in the town or country, to place himself under the direction of a magistrate, whoever he might prefer. That the whole military and police strength, combined with such assistance, might capture the hostile tribes, or permanently expel them. The solemnity of the engagement, no less than the preservation of the lives and property of the whole community, would require a serious and resolute cooperation. On former occasions, he observed such campaigns had been greatly perverted and transformed into amusement and recreation. The governor gave no promise of recompense and insisted that the effort, however meritorious, was simply the duty of all. But with his accustomed tact, he chose this moment to reward, with large grants of land, those persons already distinguished for enterprise and success, and to distribute indulgences to prisoners who had been actively employed in the service. Mr. Batman, who had devoted 12 months to the pursuit of the blacks, obtained 2,000 acres of land. Mr. Howell, of the Clyde, whose losses had been great, but who was represented as displaying an untiring spirit of humanity, was consoled with 1,000 acres. The Aboriginal Sydney Guides and Black Bill, a Tasmanian, received each 100 acres. The volunteer parties from Hobart Town were to join the force at New Norfolk. The Clyde or Richmond, those from Launceston, were to patrol the westward and Norfolk Plains, the west bank of the Tamar, or the country extending from Ben Lomond to Georgetown. Enterprising young men, inured to the bush, were requested to attach themselves to the small military parties at the outstations and under military officers to scour the northern country. Men holding tickets of leave were required to enroll under the magistrate of their district, and settlers were enjoined to equip and detach whatever servants they could spare, reserving only sufficient strength for the protection of their families. The inhabitants of Hobart Town, in public meeting assembled, tendered their service to the government for the furtherance of the object. The peace-loving Joseph Hone, Esquire, was chairman of this warlike meeting. Most of the leading speakers belonged to the profession of the gown. Mr. Kemp, one of the elder colonists, once an officer of the 102nd Regiment, who had seen the process of extermination throughout, declared that the English were chiefly the aggressors. Dr. Turnbull contrasted the effects of a vigorous resistance by government and the conflict of individuals. United effort might be followed by bloodshed, but would tend to repress the habits of violence and, at least, save a remnant from destruction. A tribe, 160 strong 4 years before, that frequented the Elizabeth River, was reduced to 60 by daily skirmishes with the stock-keepers. A question, however, arose whether it were lawful to shoot Aborigines refusing to surrender on challenge. Against this construction of law, Mr. Gellibrand earnestly protested, and maintained in warm terms their claims to sympathy and compassion. Himself, alas, destined to die by the hands of the race, it seemed, however, generally understood that capture should be attempted by the most merciful methods, but accomplished at all events. Colonization by the French was exhibited by Mr. Hackett, the distiller, in contrast with English. But Dr. Ross rose in reply and stated that there was a rock which bore the name of the Leap, from which the last 60 natives of Grenada were precipitated. Mr. R. L. Murray treated the prevailing notion of danger with derision. 3 women, he said, would put a whole tribe to flight. But Mr. Home reminded the meeting that the grass had not yet covered the graves of a mother and her children, recently slain. Thus, like the warriors of the heroic age, they debated before they armed. But it is difficult to reconcile the civic temper with military subordination. The committee nominated by the meeting to enroll the town guard suggested that volunteers should be allowed to choose each their own company, as well as their own officers. One party of 24 required the choice of their post and the right to act as an independent division. On the 22nd of September, the plan of the campaign was minutely described in a government order, and operations were fixed for the 7th of October. Its main features may be briefly stated. The Oyster Bay and Big River tribes, as the most sanguinary, were first marked out for pursuit. They were to be driven within the county of Buckingham, the utmost care being employed to prevent escape through the lines while chasing them to Tasman's peninsula. A chain of posts was occupied under Captain Wellman from St. Patrick's Head on the east coast, including the source of St. Paul's River and stretching to Campbelltown. A second chain under Major Douglas extending from Campbelltown passed south of the Macquarie to its junction with the Lake River. Both divisions, marching in a southerly direction, formed a line from Oyster Bay Tier to Lackey's Mills. During these maneuvers, a party was sent to examine the tier extending from Swan River to Spring Bay, carefully, however, concealing the movement from the natives lest they should be deterred from passing the subjacent isthmus. Other parties were employed, under Captain Wentworth, to force the Aborigines from the neighborhood of the lakes in the west towards the same center, advancing due east to the Jordan. The lines being compressed and thickened and joined by the settlers on their march were then moved forward, followed by scouring parties to guard against their escape should the natives cross the line. Fires were kept burning to direct the troops, who were expected to march in unbroken order. Captain Donaldson, who directed the operations in the north of the island, swept over the vast extent of country from Norfolk Plains to the Ouse, from Sorrel Lake to Lake Echo. There he remained, closing the avenues of escape while Douglas and Wentworth advanced to their last position. He then joined the main body. 22 parties under Major Douglas and 15 under Captain Wentworth were then sent within the lines to catch the natives or drive them toward Tasman's peninsula. The distribution of provisions to this force was entrusted to Messrs. Scott, Wedge and Sharland, surveyors. The rations were delivered to the leader of each party weekly and consisted of sugar, tea, flour and meat in considerable proportions. The principal depot was at Oatlands, where 1,000 muskets were provided, 30,000 rounds blank cartridges, 300 pairs of handcuffs, and whatever might contribute to the success of the assailants. Many thousands of rations were stored, and the settlers saw with pleasure their produce rise in the neighbourhood of this formidable band to twice its recent value. £2,000 was paid to one merchant for the tobacco. The officers, to avoid its destruction, inevitable on so long a march, mostly threw off their military clothing and assumed a uniform of Maria Island cloth, thus reserving their full dress to celebrate the coming triumph. The enthusiasm was universal. A blacksmith at Sorel, unable to follow the army, offered to repair all the guns belonging to the volunteers of his district. His example was followed by another, who, having but one leg, contributed the same service to the common cause. Nor was supplication forgotten. A form of prayer was composed for those who used formulas, and extemporary petitions were offered by other denominations. The colony at large cheerfully responded to the call of government. The military character of the plan excited the young without much alarming the mature. The inhabitants of the towns readily enrolled, and the discussions everywhere exhibited a curious mixture of martial ardour and civil pertinacity. There were many old soldiers in the colony who were amused without being repelled by this mimicry of war. More busy civilians were anxious for the formality of incorporation and the gradations of command. The townspeople were allowed their choice between more active service and garrison duties. "Gentlemen," said an old soldier, "you may call yourselves marshals, generals, and colonels, but the duties assigned you are usually performed by a corporal's guard. It is gratifying to observe that the last injunction of the governor and the last lesson of the press suggested humanity. Under the excitement of losses and bereavement, the destruction of the natives had been invoked, but now, softened by the belief that the whites were about to complete a work which had been 26 years in progress, and to expatriate the race, with one voice all said, "Spare them." The forces, including the military and constabulary, amounted to nearly 5,000. Of these, 1,500 were contributed by Hobart Town and 500 by Launceston. No army ever departed from their homes less agitated by the uncertainties of the future, and notwithstanding the dreary picture of the service drawn by the colonel commanding, there was no danger that a bridge of Lodi or a plain of Waterloo would be found in the campaign. Some went out with the keenness of sportsmen who might at least catch a kangaroo. Others were contented to live moderately well at government charge. The clerks, released from their offices, gladly embraced a holiday. The poor prisoner acted and felt as a free man and rejoiced in the interval of his servitude. And keen and canny volunteers embraced the opportunity to range the unknown territory for the discovery of some neglected spot which might offer a future home. On the 1st of October, the whole country was declared under martial law, excepting, however, from its operation, not only the British, but such of the Aborigines as were Pacific. This measure was of no great moment, except that it authorized the pursuit of all natives in every quarter. The journals not favorable to the scheme predicted its failure. There were vast probabilities against it. The nature of the force, the seat of war, the foe, the discipline, even the orders not to kill were all peculiar and discouraging. Townsmen, little accustomed to fatigue, and sportsmen not disposed to be silent, were to move sometimes in a regular and quiet line. A shot carelessly fired, the momentary slumber of an undisciplined sentinel, or the lazy evasion of a scout, might disconcert the whole campaign. No Englishman could follow up the native. The array, the number, and the glancing of muskets gave warning from afar. An European, encumbered with his dress, could only move slowly, and when passing the bush must pause every moment or be tortured at every step. but the native could swing from bough to bough, mount to the topmast branch like an opossum, move past the people seeking him diligently, or lie down until they were gone. To many of the colonists, the campaign was no child's play. The pursuit of solitary white or black rangers of the wood was exhilarating to men of great animal courage and who could enjoy long intervals of rest. But a regular march through such a country soon wore out the patience of many, and they were glad to resign the glorious undertaking to more ardent warriors. As the campaign advanced, the weather was unpropitious. Crossing the rivers became dangerous, trees had to be cut down to form temporary bridges. These obstacles cooled the spirit of volunteers, who passed rapidly from discontent to criticism, and from criticism to despair. Many crawled home, such was the indignant description of their retreat given by their comrades, and whilst the drenched but decreasing forces lay along the line, young men, it was said, crowded the streets of the capital, ignobly forgetful of the common cause. Parties were divided into threes, each forming a night watch. Fires were lighted for the night and illumined the whole distance of 30 miles, from Prosser's River to Sorel, and sentinels paced within hail of each other. The police magistrates visited the several posts on horseback, and the governor rode rapidly along the line from the Clyde to Spring Bay. Dr. Ross, recording His Excellency's exertions, states that to allow them a full description would leave no room for any other topic. His labours and perils were the theme of admiration and sympathy. It was reported that he was lost. 3 days in paradise, a place renowned for its miserable vegetation and the dreariness of its scenery. The warlike tone of the day may excite a smile, but the fatigue was indisputable, and although the slipperiness of the foe gave the air of mock heroism to the service, the watchers of the line were reminded, by frequent tidings from homeward, that their enemy was strong enough to deal death to the aged and the innocent. 4 blacks, who crossed the line and hung upon its rear, inflicted terrible vengeance. One attacked a settler, who returned a mortal wound with a pitchfork. The survivors hovered about the place to avenge his death. They at length found a victim in an amiable young lady, Miss Peters, who was speared in the breast. She felt from the first that the wound was mortal and calmly resigned herself to her destiny. Others, left by their friends and dependents, were liable to the same perils. Of this, Mr. Gildas, a settler on the Tamar, was a remarkable instance. He had sent his men to the line and was thus alone. He left his house to seek for firewood and was speared. The savages plundered his house and defaced the pictures on the walls. A pilot, calling at his dwelling, found it pillaged and desolate. This man was at the Battle of Trafalgar and present when Nelson fell, himself reserved to perish in Tasmania by savage hands. The division under Captain Donaldson, which followed up the main body of the forces, arrived on the 31st of October. Colonel Arthur issued from the camp at Sorrel Rivulet a statement that the final decisive movement was at hand, and that those who had been exposed to great privations would soon be released to their homes. Having been compelled to await reinforcements, the campaign had been unavoidably prolonged. To have moved without them would have risked the success of the enterprise. The 2 dangerous tribes would attempt to escape, and the forces in charge were exhorted to redouble their vigilance, to prevent their breaking through the position. These notices indicate a confidence of success, doomed to disappointment. To the precipitation of Mr. Walpole's party, Colonel Arthur attributed the failure of the expedition. They were instructed not to attempt a capture, unless a considerable number could be taken. But the sight of the slumbering enemy probably suspended the recollection of this order, and was one of those casualties which could hardly be avoided in such a wide distribution of command. It was on the 22nd of October this misfortune happened. The natives were discovered hunting and were watched until their evening fires were formed for the night. No noise being heard, Mr. Walpole supposed they had taken an alarm and advanced at twilight towards the first hut, where he saw 5 blacks, with their dogs, fast asleep. He seized one man by the feet and after a severe struggle detained him. A boy, ornamented with figures on his body, about 15 years of age, shared the same lot, but 2 others were shot. The remainder fled. The quantity of spears and baskets left behind proved that their flight was sudden and their numbers considerable. An attempt was made by the natives to cross the line on the 27th October. The sentry had set down his piece and was putting some wood on the fire when a spear was thrown at him. He threw the billet in his hand and was reaching his musket when he received another spear. An alarm being given to an adjoining party, the blacks were driven back, of whom, however, 6 only were seen. A circumstance occurred which strongly confirmed the impression that some treacherous whites had directed the natives. In pursuing them as far as the isthmus, they discovered in their tracks the impression of shoe nails and other evidence of the presence of white men. The reports were soon spread that the Oyster Bay and Big River tribes were in the rear. The hopes of the colony rapidly gave way, and the governor, writing to the Secretary of State on the 21st of November, intimated his suspicion that the movement would be in vain. These reports were, indeed, constantly circulated and tended to damp the ardour and diminish the vigilance of the line. Some scouring parties from Norfolk Plains fell in with a tribe of 40, whom they pursued beyond the Shannon. They followed them for 3 days, but were compelled to return. The blacks, in their progress, had surprised a settler and murdered him. The rumours of escape were aggravated by imagination. A party of the whites were seen by some sawyers, who ran away and reported them as natives, and it was several days before they could be persuaded of their error. The settlers, worn out with fatigue and longing for their homes, were impatient to advance, and afforded ample opportunities for concealment and escape. Among the rest, a place is noticed, which enabled the natives to defy intrusion or discovery, near the Three Thumbs Mountain, an almost impenetrable forest, of 7 miles extent. The spreading branches obscure the sky, and lofty plants grow entwined and conceal an object at the distance of a few feet. The attempt of the blacks to cross the line discovered their retreat. It was resolved to assemble forces sufficient to surround, break through, and storm this thicket. It was penetrated by about 300 men, who kept up a constant fire of musketry. A party, hearing the rustling of leaves like the noise of cattle, followed the sound. They came up to an encampment where the fires were unextinguished and where half-formed weapons indicated a hasty dispersion. Here they found the impression of nails and what were deemed sure proofs of a superior directing intelligence. The presumption that some convicts were incorporated with the blacks was certainly strong, but it was probably but a temporary or casual intercourse of not much utility to the natives. The governor had, however, a full conviction that to this circumstance the failure might be partly ascribed. In the middle of the march, he ordered the publication of a report which appeared decisive of the fact. Savage, a servant of Mr. Bisdee, was met half-naked by the governor near Mills's lagoon, to whom he stated he had been surrounded by a tribe and rescued from violence by a man named Brown, who was with them. This person he had known in jail. Savage advised Brown to bring in the natives, but he refused. He said that he had been frequently at Hobart Town, where he had bought clothes for the women. He had a double-barreled gun and seemed to have complete control over them. They carried Savage with them as far as Mills's lagoon, when he was told he might go. The governor and his party instantly set off in the pursuit, but they discovered no traces of the natives. The truth of this narrative has been questioned, yet from the number of points in which a correct memory or extraordinary powers of invention would be requisite, the governor might have easily detected imposition. The man stated that fright cured him of rheumatism. His rags were consistent with his story. It is, however, the only clear testimony to the presence of white men with the blacks at that period. On the 26th of November, it was announced by the governor that the first series of operations was brought to a close, and except a few, requisite to protect the country, the colonists and their servants were released, and the town guards replaced. Those who had condemned the plan now censured its precipitate abandonment. They said that hundreds of blacks were enclosed when the troops were withdrawn. It is not likely, however, that the governor was deceived on this point. It is certain that many blacks were in the rear, and the dispersion of the force was equal to a confession that the object was impracticable, that it had failed. Thus closed the Black War. This campaign of a month supplied many adventures and many an amusing tale, and, notwithstanding the gravity of His Excellency, much fun and folly. The settler soldiers returned to their homes, their shoes worn out, their garments tattered, their hair long and shaggy, with beards unshaven, their arms tarnished, but neither blood-stained nor disgraced. They had seen much and dreaded more, but in general they met no other enemies than scrub and thorns, and they sat down on their own hearths, happy in having escaped the ramrods of their friends. The odd tactics, awkward movements, the skulking and the foraging, and all the various small accomplishments of a bivouac were long topics of conversation and laughter. The accidents were few, though of these some were fatal. 2 Aborigines only were captured, and 1 soldier was wounded. Yet though not very glorious, perhaps no evening in the year passes, but some settler's fireside is enlivened by a story of the fatigues and frolics of the Black War. When the last movement was completing, the Science sailed for England with dispatches from Colonel Arthur. They indicate his expectation of a failure and scarcely conceal his mortification. Either the original impossibility of the plan or the indolence or incaution of those who carried it out had exposed the government to more than ridicule. 5,000 men had taken the field beside the town guard. Nearly £30,000 had been expended, and probably not much less value in time and outlay by the settlers, and 2 persons only were captured. Those who prophesied the result, of course, exulted in their sagacity. For the rest, they either praised the motive or the details. An impartial retrospect will not permit a commendation of the plan. The arrangements were ably made, and the parties, though they encountered difficulties unusual, reached the appointed places with considerable precision. A public meeting was called to thank the governor for his exertions in the field. This assembly was summoned, says the chronicler of the Times, by the largest placard ever published in the colony. The resolutions and addresses were nearly unanimous, Mr. Gregson being almost singly opposed to this tribute of gratitude. It was objected by this gentleman that while the activity of the governor was not to be disputed, exertions wisely directed were alone worthy of praise. And he compared the project for netting the Aborigines with an attempt to harpoon a whale from the heights of Mount Wellington. The ardour of the people would not, however, admit a comparison which it required at that moment some political resentment to perceive. Nor is it precisely just to estimate the merits of a plan by the success of its application. A colonist at a glance sees, in the names which were attached to the addresses, that the war was popular. All parties of every shade contributed something to that warmth of commendation which had been hitherto paid by one alone. In every district of the colony, the applauses of Hobart Town were re-echoed, and the governor's replies gave back an exchange of praise. To suppose that Colonel Arthur expected military renown from such an enterprise is certainly to underestimate his ambition. To imagine that he valued a military spectacle is not consistent with a mind much too practical for chivalry. His avowed and real object was to stop the murder of his countrymen and to arrest the extinction of the natives, and it was not unworthy the public gratitude. The governor was delighted, however, by those proofs of the discipline of the prisoners, which were afforded through the campaign. Many hundreds were in arms. They performed their duty with exemplary diligence and sobriety, and thus afforded the only spectacle which Colonel Arthur valued. It was certainly unprecedented. Slaves have been armed by their masters, their wives and children were hostages, but convicts never. Robberies were less frequent than usual, and the journals singularly free from the details of crime. The animating influence of confidence reposed elevates the least romantic natures. Since they were trusted, they were faithful. All returned home to their servitude. End of chapter 47, being the Aborigines, section 6.